да ни въведе в сериала Новата Европа според Марко Пелин. Съвсем накратко, защото след това ще си говорим много.
So, in brief, we've done 3 of these big journeys across the Sahara and the Himalaya, and we thought the BBC were very keen to have us do another one because they're very popular.
Ние вече направихме други 2 такива сериали в Сахара и в Хималаите и решихме, че BBC ще се заинтересува да направим и 3-ти сериал в Европа.
And initially we thought of doing a trip from Panama down to South America, another big adventure.
Първоначално всъщност мислихме да снимаме от Панама до най-южната част на Южна Америка.
And then literally over a cup of tea Michael actually decided that he didn't want to go that far because he'd got a new grandson.
И после, буквално пиейки си чая един ден, Майкъл Пелин реши, че всъщност не иска да ходи чак толкова далеч, защото току-що му се беше родило поредното внуче.
So in about 10 minutes we decided to do, let's do Eastern Europe.
Така че за около 10 минути решихме, айде да преместим всичко в Източна Европа.
There are very few people who you can just tell any broadcaster that we're changing our mind, but actually we're very fortunate and the BBC just said fine, go wherever you want, doesn't matter.
И е много трудно да убедите BBC, примерно, да си сменят намеренията толкова лесно, но ние успяхме и в крайна сметка заснехме филма си в Източна Европа.
So it's a sort of level of trust they have with what we do and the fact that it's successful, I think.
Което пък показва нивото на доверие, което те имат спрямо нас и нашата работа.
So we said, okay, let's do what we used to call the Eastern Bloc. There'll be lots of discussions about what it was exactly, particularly Yugoslavia, but let's do that part of the world, which Michael didn't know at all, really. And then I thought, well, let's do Turkey as well, because it might become part of Europe, and broaden it out to the countries that want to be part of the new Europe, basically.
Така че решихме да заснемем сериала в Източна Европа. Малко поспорихме за това какво точно се включва Източна Европа за някои страни, примерно като Югославия. След това разширихме обхвата до Турция, тъй като тя е кандидат за член на Европейския съюз. И в крайна сметка обхванахме множество страни, които малко или повече спадат към идеята за Източна Европа. А Майкъл Пайлин въобще не познаваше тази част от Европа.
And I'll say one more thing and then we can see some clips. And in a way it's been the most difficult of all the series, partly because it's so close to home. It's familiar in terms of the way people look and dress and often how they behave. So it hasn't got the exoticism of going up the Himalayas or whatever. And there's a huge variety and history, so there was a lot more choices to be made. So it was much more difficult for us to do than the Himalaya. There are only 2 roads across the mountains, so that's easy. Europe, you can go anywhere to anywhere. So it was a big challenge.
И всъщност беше много по-трудно да направим сериала тук, защото тази част от Европа е близка като цяло, като менталитет на хората и като начин на обличане. Няма тази екзотика, която примерно ще имате, ако отидете в Хималая. И в Хималаята е много по-лесно, имате точно 2 пътя, които пресичат планината. А тук има разнообразие, тук има история, тук има избор, така че ни беше доста по-трудно.
Largely because I didn't really know my own continent. And I kind of assumed I did. We dashed off to the North Pole, the South Pole, Hong Kong, Chile, wherever. I always came back, flew over Europe. And thought, oh yes, one day I'll do that. But although I knew France and knew Spain, I didn't know the eastern side of Europe at all. Largely because during my lifetime that had been behind the Iron Curtain. It'd been very difficult to get there. And yet it is very close. Most of the destinations we went to were in 2, certainly 3 hours flying time. And it suited me to do something different from Himalaya and Sahara, which didn't rely purely on extraordinary geography, but also were really more about people and culture, politics and history and all that sort of stuff that was quite close to me. So it was a voyage of discovery to Eastern Europe for me, because I hadn't been to many of these countries. The other thing was that it seems to be a very important time for Europe. What's happened since the 1990s is that a lot of countries have become independent, new countries have been created. There's a terrific mood of optimism and excitement and hope for these countries that at last they've, discovered their own identity, their own language, their own currency, all that sort of thing. And yet they're going to be, via the European Union, part of a wider whole which is Europe. So there'll actually be sort of cooperation in Europe rather than conflict and conquest and all the things that have traditionally held the continent together. So it did seem a really interesting period. What's going to happen to Europe and with all these new countries? So that's why I decided to call it New Europe rather than Eastern Europe, because we also go to Turkey, we go to Ukraine. It's really more about the uniting of Europe and the countries that want to be part of it. And also, as I say, seeing a lot of new places. We will have travelled through 20 countries, which is twice as many as Himalaya and Sahara put together. There's just an awful lot of countries out there now. Although the distances aren't enormous, the differences between these countries are quite considerable. Most of the countries I didn't know at all well. I had been through Eastern Europe in 1986. I've been to Prague a couple of times. I've been to Estonia, for instance, and Istanbul on pole to pole on the other journeys, but only very briefly. And most of the countries were quite new to me. So I was interested to see how the ones I knew had changed and what the rest were like. And places like Estonia changed considerably, because when we went in there in 1990 on pole to pole, it was part of the Soviet Union, and the docks were just patrolled by a few soldiers, and they sort of glowered at anybody coming in. Now they've got an enormous sort of dock area, tourist facilities, people welcoming you, showing you around. There's bars and cafes everywhere. It's a very high-tech country now, Estonia. The whole Wi-Fi, the whole area. You can use a computer anywhere and all that sort of stuff. It's really made a giant leap from being a Soviet republic without a great deal going for it to something now which is an independent country with only 1.5 million people, but extraordinarily sort of inventive and creative and lively too. So, there were changes. I did have an image, which a lot of people of my generation probably shared, which is that Europe, the Soviet bloc, the eastern part of Europe, was largely monochrome. There was no colour there, it was just grey. It was huge, great sort of concrete blocks, and barbed wire and soldiers and guard posts and all that sort of thing, the Berlin Wall. These were our images of Europe. And part of the reason I wanted to do this journey was to sort of correct this impression, because clearly there was colour. I mean, you don't suddenly switch on colour when the politics change. There must have been beautiful places as well. There must have been old cities, there must have been old towns, there must have been mountains, there must have been lakes. And so I wanted to sort of put some colour, for us to put some colour back into Eastern Europe. And of course, we found out that it is full of beautiful places. There's countryside that's much less spoiled than it is in the West. Places like the Danube Delta. There's a wonderful sort of sandbar called the Curonian Spit, which goes down from Latvia into a place called Kaliningrad. Wonderful area for some wild birds, migrating birds and all that. The Carpathian Mountains, not many people know them very well. They're very, very beautiful mountain ranges. So we did discover that the rest of the continent is very beautiful. There was lots of colour. And in the cities as well, some were beautifully preserved, others have been restored after the war. I mean, the worst thing about Eastern Europe was that there was terrific damage in the war, both from Germans going in, Russians coming in to relieve the cities after the war, and the Allies, ourselves included, bombing a lot of these cities because, we wanted to get the Germans out. So they were really badly damaged. And yet, a lot of them brilliantly restored, someone like Gdansk, which was Danzig in Poland, or Warsaw in Poland as well. Beautifully restored, lovely cities. And so, yeah, I thought this looks great. You know, it isn't monochrome at all. It isn't grey. It was like that at one time. It was a bit like the sort of welcome that you got when you used to go there, which was very sort of guarded, because they didn't really, you know, want to have much connection with the outside world. Now they're so much more friendly, and I'm showing you where the local bookshop is, where there's a cafe, where there's a club, a real feeling that you know, colour had come back into their lives, and they had more options and more chances, and their countries were every bit as beautiful as those in Western Europe. Part of the, for me, you know, the sort of revelation of the journey was countries that I really hadn't heard of. Moldova, Kaliningrad, Transnistria, places like names that meant nothing to me. Now I know more about them. And Moldova, for instance, is a Russian republic in the north of the Black Sea, quite small. There's only about 5 million people, and yet in Moldova there are 2 breakaway republics. I mean, how tough is that? You've only got a small country that's split into 3 parts anyway. And part of the problem was in Moldova that some of it is Russian and some of it's Romanian, because it's like a lot of the countries on the edge of the Russian border, they're sort of torn both ways to either be part of the old Soviet bloc and they have affinities with Russia, and the others desperately want to become part of the European Union. And so in Moldova, you had Moldova itself, and then a small republic called Transnistria, across the Dniester River, literally, which was very Russian-oriented. And they'd had a war in the 1990s against Moldova, and had set up this breakaway republic, which nobody but themselves recognises. But we went there on their national day. They had their own march past and their own sort of festival and their own sort of celebrations. So I'd not heard of Moldova, and you know, I'd not even heard of, obviously not heard of Transnistria, the breakaway republic. And in there's a part of Russia and Europe still left over from the war called Kaliningrad, which is the very northeastern part of Germany. And you come down from the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, you suddenly find yourself in this country in the middle of sort of European countries, like European EU countries now, like Poland and the Baltics, and yet it's part of Russia. It's completely ringed by European Union countries. But again, we were there, able to film on their national day, and to see a tiny little country like that, which is a sort of province of Russia really, of about 2 or 3 million people, revelling in their own sort of customs and their own way of doing things, is quite, it was really intriguing. And I say 20 countries in a fairly small, short distance that we covered was quite amazing. Places like Albania and Macedonia, which I knew almost nothing about, I now know a little bit more. I now short distance that we covered was quite amazing. Places like Albania and Macedonia, which I knew almost nothing about, I now know a little bit more. I now know there's lots to see there. I now know there's lots of interest in foreigners coming in and all that sort of stuff. I found there were quite ambivalent attitudes to the European Union. Those who were doing well and making a bit of money liked the idea of a European Union because it's freeing up jobs, it's freeing up money for projects and all that. And they see the European Union as being a very generous hand, financing businesses, enabling them to sort of make cars in their country to sell all over Europe, which they wouldn't have been able to do in the old days when Europe was split in 2. Others lower down the scale, the earning scale. Certainly a lot of older people feel there was a kind of certainty, kind of quiet sort of protective confidence that they had in the old Soviet days. They may not have been allowed to travel, they may not have been allowed to make a profit, they may not have been allowed to, you know, play the stock exchange, but they were reasonably comfortable, well protected within their own country. And for those people, I think there's a certain amount of fear that the European Union may just come in. In will come the businessmen, they will make the money, the people at the bottom will get ripped off. And there's a lot of evidence of that happening. The tough, clever businessmen are doing very well out of it. Unfortunately, also a lot of pretty dark and devious businesses like sex trafficking and drugs are also sort of coming in to fill the vacuum. It's the free market, you know, some of it will be good, some of it will be bad. And I think that's something that's really going to have to be ironed out in the next few years. But I say, for the moment, the general feeling amongst most of the people we met, most of the sort of, I suppose you could say, more educated people, was that the European Union was a good thing. It would give them a chance to play on a bigger stage, and it would, you know, replace the oppression of the Soviet Union with the sort of liberal generosity of the rest of Europe. But others said, well, you know, it's going to be tricky. And a very interesting quote which someone said was that it's like exchanging years of claustrophobia for years of agoraphobia. And in one way, you know, they were all right. You couldn't move far, but you knew where you were. Now you can go anywhere you want, but the choice is almost too much for a lot of people. And one feature of the journey in all the countries that East Europe went to was the drain of labour, and very often qualified labour, out of those countries to Western Europe. A lot of doctors, specialists, scientists, whatever, will be going over to get more opportunity and more work outside the country. Because previously they weren't allowed to travel, now they can. Hopefully that will bring back money and they'll bring those skills back to the country. But the brain drain and the labour drain is quite a major problem for a lot of the countries.
I think there was a nervousness about doing Eastern Europe, and the controller of BBC One said, oh, couldn't you go back to the South American one? But in the end, I think there was a confidence that Michael would bring an audience to something which is, what they said is Europe is a complete turn-off. It's not sexy as a subject. No one will watch it. That was the worry. As it turned out, more people watched the Europe than watched Himalaya or Sahara. So they were very surprised, obviously delighted, and got the largest viewing figures of any factual programme of the year. And in fact was sort of number 7 with all the soap operas and Big Brother. It did far better than any of those. So there is an audience to find out about this part of Europe, you know, as it's been proven. And it's also sold. No, that's a bit later, but I'll do it now. I think it's sold better than any of the other series, and partly I think because there's so many Europeans who have gone to Australia and South America, so it's done very well. Well, you kind of start all these things in the same way, that there is a broad plan of what you want to do in a journey, and then within that, you just meet people. A lot of it's serendipity. Somebody says, oh, have you heard about that, or do you know about that? So it's an odd mixture of planning and hazard, and often the stuff that happens by chance is the most interesting. And other stuff that you think should be good isn't. So, and in that way, the boring stuff actually doesn't make it into the film. It's as simple as that. There's a sort of coherence in the journey that you want to cover there, you know, a bit of culture, not very much politics, but geography. So it's a very broad categories that we can span. No, we didn't do very much politics, that's very true. The research is done, a lot of it you do it on the web initially. Actually, I talked to a cleaning lady who's from Bulgaria, so we talked about, you know, what was interesting about Bulgaria. And then it's very much who you meet, and you meet people, in this case through Tita, because it showed some of the Python stuff, so you know, there's a point of contact, and that leads one thing from another. It's a bit like a detective. Yeah, no, I think it's a good point, and in fact we filmed both the gypsies in Plovdiv, we did other stuff in Plovdiv, and Papirikon. I mean, in the end, it's kind of what's interesting, I'm afraid. And when you looked at the sequence in Papirikon, it wasn't that grabby. If I'm doing a current affairs story for BBC Two, I could do an archaeology programme fine. This is a very broad, popular sort of journey, so you have to do it a bit, make it more entertaining. It's why Costa Rica makes films about gypsies rather than archaeology films. I mean, there's a natural attraction. It's not a balanced view, it never pretends to be a balanced view. We don't aim to make balanced programmes. It's a journey of things that are interesting. And believe me, every country has complained about some aspect of what we've filmed and didn't like it. And often, you know, that we did more in one country than another. But that's just, in the end, you make a choice about what seems to work for the film and make it interesting and entertaining.